I'm so excited to be speaking today at the 7th Annual Neurodiversity Pride Day Neuroemergence Conference 2024. Do you remember your first day in middle school? I'll never forget mine. The first thing that happened was our teachers handed out locker assignments. They were little pieces of paper with our locker number and our locker combination on them. And we filed out into the hallway to open our lockers for the very first time. And all around me, my fellow students' lockers were springing open with no trouble at all. And meanwhile, I was twisting my knob so carefully, left and then right and then left, and nothing I could do could get it to open. And I could have asked for help, but to be honest, I could already tell that this whole locker concept was not going to work for me. Even if I could find this corner of my sprawling 3-story middle school ever again, I would definitely lose the piece of paper that had all this information written on it. My solution? 2 backpacks. One on front, one on back. And I carried all of my books and my violin to every single class for 2 years. As you can imagine, I was a very popular kid in middle school. If you're neurodivergent like me, I bet you have a similar story. The details will be different, but the bottom line is the same. We are all living in a world that was designed for and by people with brains and abilities that are very different from our own. This gives us a common experience and a common cause to fight for a world where neurodivergence isn't just accommodated, but is celebrated. After all, at a moment when humanity is facing existential level crisis, we need all brains on deck. But first, we neurodivergents have to recognize that we have a lot more in common than we may realize. I'm going to tell you my story, and along the way, I'm going to flag some other common experiences that may sound familiar to you. The first one I've already covered, this feeling of living in a world where there's an expectation that you can do things that you just can't do. I'm a science reporter specializing in psychology and neuroscience, and for the last 2 decades, I've written extensively about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, just about everything else. I've always thought of myself, however, as fairly neurotypical, so it was quite a surprise at the age of 39 when I learned that my mind and my brain and my experience of human consciousness is actually quite unusual in a variety of different ways. What happened was, I was grocery shopping with my husband. He was ahead of me, and I noticed all of a sudden he was filling our cart with all sorts of things that he never usually buys. And so I grabbed a jar of Safeway Select brand peanut butter out of our cart, brandished it like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial, and I said, "Steve, since when do you buy generic?" And Steve looked at me with this look of horror on his face. And I almost turned around to see what had spooked him. But then all at once, I realized that this man was not my husband. He just sort of vaguely looked like my husband. And it actually wasn't until several years later, when reflecting on that experience, that I had the insight that I had been faster to recognize a label, the wrong label on a jar of peanut butter, than the wrong face on my husband. This had me concerned, and a normal person probably would have called a doctor, a neurologist, but I'm a science writer, and so my first instinct was to do research. And pretty soon I started emailing scientists and asking them questions that I hoped sound casual. Things like, how do people normally recognize them? Or, all husbands kind of look alike, right? I got myself into a study at Harvard, and I found out that I am in the bottom 3% of people when it comes to face recognition. According to one scientist, I have the face recognition abilities of a below average macaque. And it didn't stop there. I kept digging, and I found out that I am neurodivergent in several ways. I'm also stereoblind, which means I can't see in 3D. I live in a world that is a lot flatter than the one that most people live in. I can't visualize. I didn't realize that other people could. I thought when people said things like seeing the future or imagining themselves on a beach watching a sunset, that we were all being metaphorical. I didn't understand that some people can actually do this. And I also have something called SDAM, which stands for Severely Deficient Autobiographical Memory. And it's exactly what it sounds like. My autobiographical memory is stored as stories, as words, not as images or not as experiences that I can go back and relive. This last one had me a little confused and concerned because I write about myself a lot, and I had actually just gotten a book deal to write about myself, and I wondered if I needed to keep this under wraps in order to keep my book deal. I ended up including it in the book. Learning all of this about myself was a shock, but it also made so much sense. All of a sudden, some long-running mysteries about my life snapped into place. For instance, why have I never been asked out on a date? Why did I have so much trouble making friends? Why can't I catch a frisbee? Why am I always stubbing my toes? The details of your story, I'm sure, are different than mine, but I bet at some point in your life you learned something about yourself that made everything snap into place. And that's the second thing I believe we neurodivergents have in common. A sort of transformative experience where we realize that our perspective is radically different than other people's. Also, like me, I imagine a lot of you have more than one diagnosis. This is a very typical experience for neurodivergents. 36% of autistic people are also face blind. 20 to 30% of people with ADHD are also autistic. And upwards of 30% of people with dyslexia also have ADHD. This widespread comorbidity is just one reason why scientists are beginning to think that perhaps we neurodivergents are all variations on the same theme and that we all belong under one big umbrella. Even after learning all these things about myself, I was slow to think of myself as neurodivergent. There were a lot of reasons for this, but one of them is because none of my issues add up to a diagnosis in the DSM. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, and it's published by the American Psychiatric Association. So I had no official diagnosis. This was also true when I was in middle school. I was getting C's and D's. I was constantly lost. I couldn't memorize the times tables or spell or learn to write in cursive. I had exactly one friend. And every so often, I would get hauled down to the guidance counselor's office and given tests. But my scores did not qualify me for any official diagnosis. There are a lot of people like me who struggle with things that most people find to be trivially easy, like telling your left from your right or keeping track of time. But since we aren't described in the DSM, we are led to believe that we are neurotypical. The thing is, What I've recently learned is that the DSM is problematic. You don't have to take my word for it. Thomas Ansel, the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health, said as much right before the new manual came out way back in 2015. It's still used by healthcare workers, but scientists increasingly agree that the labels in the DSM have no link to physical reality. I'm not asking you to give up on your labels yet, but consider this study from 2020. Researchers at the University of Cambridge gathered data on the brain structure and function of 479 children and fed it to a machine learning algorithm. And they asked it what natural groupings emerged. The computer came back with just two groups, neurodivergent and neurotypical. What distinguished these two groups? When you look at the white matter of neurotypical kids, you see more of a hub and spoke network. This is the system that airlines use, and it ensures that you never have to make more than one connection to get where you're trying to go. Neurodivergent people have more of a daisy chain network. And so this explains why often we have uneven patterns of strengths and weaknesses. In my brain, for instance, there's a direct flight from pitch perception to memory, but the route from visual perception to memory requires several layovers, and your luggage is likely to get lost along the way. I've been seeing a lot of research like this, and I suspect that in the long run, many of the labels that we know and love are going to go the way of neuroaesthesia and the vapors. They're going to sound really vague and old-fashioned. The human brain, after all, has 800 million neurons, and each one of these has thousands of connections. They're all bathed in a poorly understood chemical soup, and the idea that these wildly complex objects might naturally fall into just a handful of groups is frankly ludicrous. Even the neurodivergent, neurotypical divide that I just described is, of course, a spectrum, with more neurotypical brains being more hub and spoke-like, and more neurodivergent brains being more daisy chain-like. The cascade of events, the intricate dance between genes and environment that led to your particular brain setup is probably unique to you. This is all to say, do not be scared off if you don't have a diagnosis. If you suspect that your brain works differently from other people, it probably does. If you feel like an alien living in a world made for and by creatures with different abilities than your own, you may call yourself neurodivergent. Welcome to the club. Another reason I was slow to see myself as neurodivergent is because I'm doing fine. I've carved out a niche for myself that capitalizes on my strengths and minimizes my weaknesses. But if you were to drop me back in middle school, I would have the exact same problems that I had the first time around. What I have now is what I want for all neurodivergent people: the opportunity to contribute and thrive, not in spite of our unusual brains, but because of them. To create this world, we need big tent neurodiversity. So even if you don't have an official diagnosis, even if you don't need accommodation, even if you do a pretty good job fitting into the neurotypical world, please join me on this Neurodiversity Pride Day and proclaiming yourself proudly neurodivergent. Together, we can create a world that welcomes all kinds of brains. Thank you so much.